Throughout this midterm election season, we have been pretty critical of some of Democratic leadership's moves when it comes to supporting, whether monetarily or in terms of rhetoric, extreme Republican candidates in the primary cycle that then went on to the general election. Well, now we've been through those midterms, so I think it's a good time to take stock of how that strategy worked out. And to do that, we are very lucky to be joined by political reporter for The Intercept, Akela Lacy. Welcome back to the Deranged Report.
Hey, John, how's it going?
It's great to have you here. I'm excited to see what you came up with in your research. You have a write-up on The Intercept right now about this strategy. And I know that one of the races, at least Herschel Walker, has not yet been determined. But tell me a little bit about your look into this strategy.
Yeah, so there was some coverage of this, more during primary season, but we wanted to really take a look at how close races were where Democrats had intervened in Republican primaries, whether that was spending on ads sort of highlighting Republican candidates' ties to Trump, or in the case of the Arizona gubernatorial primary, the state Democratic Party in Arizona sent an email basically like boosting Kari Lake, a couple weeks out from the primary. And that ended up being, one of the races that took the longest to count. So we basically just went back through some of these races and did talk to strategists and analysts, some of whom, thought that the strategy was pretty foolproof and, agreed that it had been relatively successful this cycle, and others who pointed out sort of the long-term potential, negative ramifications of doing something like this, as far as normalizing, extremism, but also spending. We're talking about $50 million plus this cycle, spending precious party resources on a tactic that is questionable, where while candidates in other races, could have been moved significantly by just a fraction of the money that was spent deploying this strategy.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to not think of, the Lauren Boebert congressional race, which was incredibly tight. What if the Democrats had invested there? But obviously there's a bit of hindsight being applied there. Before we jump into overall evaluations of the strategy, you mentioned there are a couple of the forms that the help came in. It could be monetary, it could be rhetorical or sending out messages. In terms of how widespread this strategy was, I can think of a few examples. You mentioned a few there. I can think of like Mastriano and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
How common was this? Are we talking 5 races like Dr. Oz? Are we talking 30 races, 100 races? How many races were the Democrats weighing in on this in this way?
Yeah, so I mean, if talking just across the country, we're looking at more than a dozen races, 9+ states. This was pretty widespread, sort of in terms of geographic distribution, up and down the ballot. We're talking about gubernatorial races, Senate races, congressional races. So we saw this being, deployed. And again, this is, not necessarily a new strategy in the Democratic Party, but certainly the breadth and depth of the contests in which we saw this happening this cycle was significant, just in terms of the number and the types of races. And obviously that has something to do with the fact that, a lot of these candidates were outright election deniers, and that was, part of highlighting that at least was a key piece of the strategy. So it makes sense in that regard, like just the growth and the number of the types and the number of races that we saw this happening in. But yeah, we're talking about New Hampshire, Virginia, Colorado, California, Nevada. We mentioned Arizona, we mentioned Pennsylvania. So yeah, all over the country, and in really, key competitive swing states is really the underscoring point here, particularly with the Mastriano spending.
Okay. And the strategy seems to be, I mean, I'm sure there's other aspects to it, but generally these candidates will be less electable. A regular establishment Republican would do better. I generally accept that concept. Do we have good data though? Like, is this actually a data-driven hypothesis? Now that we have the actual elections to look back on, does it appear that that was accurate in general?
Yeah, so I mean, just anecdotally, like we were, ahead of election night, we were talking about this story, and we ended up doing sort of a look back, because several of the races that looked really close on election night, Democrats did end up winning. So talking particularly about Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire. She ended up winning by like 10 points, but that was one of the races that was looking a little closer up until the end of ballot counting. And then, particularly the Kari Lake race. I mean, we didn't have the results from that race until like a week out. So those were two that were. I think the takeaway is that this strategy, at a baseline, if working is that Democrats won their races, then it worked in most cases this cycle. But I think what we wanted to try to tease out was that a lot of the races were way closer than they should have been, sort of like following the logic of that theory. And the point being that even if somebody is deemed sort of unelectable, or if it's easier to put a Democrat up against someone who is affiliated with sort of a dying part of the Trump Republican Party in terms of election denialism, in a cycle where the most sort of galvanizing issues for the Democratic Party are on the ballot around abortion and the economy and gun control and criminal justice stuff. The idea that sort of just amplifying the fact that if you don't vote for Democrats, you're going to get a lunatic. Like that seems like not the best use of Democratic Party resources, but also in terms of looking forward to 2024, not the best or necessarily most forward-thinking way to engage and make sure that the base is really still engaged. So I think that that's sort of what we tried to tease out a little bit in the analysis in the piece.
Yeah, and of course, those candidates don't just go away after losing. Kari Lake now has a more national platform that she probably would not have had she just been second place Kari Lake in the primary. She could end up being the VP nominee. She could end up being the vice president as a result of this. So that's certainly interesting going forward. By the way, it seems like now the Democrats in theory could be facing a similar sort of situation when it comes to what it's looking like the Republican presidential primary will look like. I mean, DeSantis is obviously a radical in his own way, but Trump seems less electable right now. The strategists that you've talked to, I know that they're evaluating the midterms, but does it seem like the Democrats will take away from this? This is a strategy they should use going forward, or should we expect them to do the same sort of thing in Senate and gubernatorial primaries in this coming election, maybe weighing in on the part of Trump against DeSantis so that he's likely to win?
Yeah, I mean, it's a valid question. I think, and the fact that, a DeSantis Trump primary could push Democrats to pull back from this is sort of, speaks to the recklessness of the strategy in some ways, that, it might work in some cases, but when you're talking about sort of like the mother of the election denialism, do you really want to risk boosting Trump and having a replay of 2016? I think that's sort of what we're trying to get at here. Like, where is the limit of the strategy? And I would also just point out that, one of the people that I spoke with, who he didn't make it into the article, but Mike Podhorzer, former top strategist at the AFL-CIO, was making the point that it is sort of, making the distinction, on the part of the Democratic Party, but also from media, making the distinction between, it's sort of an arbitrary distinction between like the most extremist parts of the Republican Party and more moderate parts, when you're talking about, people who at the end of the day, in large part went along with election denialism, whether they held more moderate stances on other policies. And looking forward, with Republicans saying that they want their next priority in the House to be impeaching Joe Biden, if everyone's going to fall in line behind that, then like, do these distinctions really mean anything at the end of the day? And Democrats playing into that. So yeah, I think 2024 will certainly be an interesting question about this, but I can't imagine that we're going to see Democrats boosting Trump, but crazier things have happened.
We've seen it in the past, so everyone buckle up. It's going to be an exciting election. In any event, Akela, appreciate your work over The Intercept, which everyone watching should definitely go check out. And we appreciate you joining us, especially on the cusp of Thanksgiving. So thank you for giving us some of your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and have a nice holiday.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.